But this is the way in which most people experience and will experience the diabolical. You think you're committing a lot of, relatively mundane sins, just some casual, low-level backbiting and office politics and things like that. And then suddenly you walk into the next room and you find yourself face to face, so to speak, with the devil. Hi everyone, this is Sarah from Hamilton, and today we are back with Richard Rohlin to begin our discussion of the last book of the Cosmic Trilogy, and that is That Hideous Strength. Now, That Hideous Strength is longer than the other two books, so we are going to split this into two parts. So you're going to see a second discussion on this book. So thanks so much for coming on, Richard.
Yeah, really pleased to be here. Let's do this. It's tell you what, reading this book and then just like watching the news is like a little uncomfortable.
Yeah. There was a great meme that went around recently about That Hideous Strength, and the conclusion of the meme is when you finish the book, I definitely believe that our scientists are talking to demons.
So I was talking to somebody, this will date this video a little bit, which is bad manners. I guess you're supposed to make all your content evergreen. But anyway, there was another attempted assassination of Donald Trump, who is a presidential candidate, for people who don't know who that is, watching this video in 100 years or whatever. So this is the second attempt now on the life of a presidential candidate. And I'm not making a statement for or against Donald Trump, not here to endorse a political party, but I was talking to somebody who made the comment, is like, look at this, just another purposeless loner. That's what they said about the shooters, another purposeless loner. And I don't know if they intended to just kind of write it off and say it was just a whack job or whatever, or they're like reacting against conspiracy theories. But the thing that we need to understand is that the evil that's going on in the world around us, and the attempted assassination of a political candidate certainly qualifies as an evil thing. I think most reasonable people agree, regardless of what political party they belong to. Most of the evil that goes on in the world around us is not purposeless, in the sense of the person who did this definitely had a purpose, and or they were being driven by something, right? They were being driven by something. I said, well, it's not purposeless, it's a diabolical purpose, right? There is something evil driving this person to do this thing. And the person I was talking to was a Christian, but they were like, well, what do you mean by diabolical? And I think that we just sort of assume that the supernatural doesn't really have, how do I put this? We sort of assume the supernatural doesn't really have an impact on like world events in that same sense. And like whenever somebody will say, oh, well, the reason my candidate won is because God was behind him or her, And so whenever somebody says something like that, it's like, okay, well, it's like somebody thanking God when they win a basketball game. Well, did you thank God all the other times that you lost? Now, actually, you should thank God when you win a basketball game, but that's a different conversation. But anyway, the thing I'm trying to say is that even for a lot of Christians, we think that the spiritual realm is more or less neutral, and that when we are talking about politics or we're talking about events in the world, that we're only allowed to talk and think about the realm of the purely material. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, you're only allowed to think about the realm of the purely material. I won't say secular, because a lot of religious people are very actively involved politically, but even then they mostly think about how can we affect a win through this strategy or this thing or this thing. And yeah, when something really bad happens, it's just these bad human actors. And we don't think, of course it is bad human actors, but we don't think about the spiritual component to this. So this book is like, got to be almost a little careful with this book, right? Because you're liable to kind of like, start seeing demons under every rug, which is not wrong, but also not the main thing that we need to be focused on. But the book itself is quite beautiful. I'm not saying that it's dangerous in that way, but like the first time you read it, you're like, whoa,
Yeah.
And then it takes a while to kind of like simmers it down. And this is one of the things I love about this book, is the way that they show how the demonic is directly and indirectly involved in basically progressivism, right? And the whole project that comes with it, which is something Lewis was saying in his own day and age, and something which seems to still be going on now. So
yeah. And I think that's really one of the things that you see as you work through the book in its narrative orders, that you see the veil gradually being pulled away. It starts in a very different way than the other books do. The other books kind of start off and they throw you right into deep heaven, more or less. This one, you start off with a couple who's recently married. I think they were married about 6 months prior to the beginning of the book's narrative, and things aren't going so well. One of the ways actually that I like to see this book, and I think Lewis probably meant it this way, is that Perelandra is a story from Ransom's perspective of how Tor and Tinadril were separated. They had their distinct set of experiences. We only really hear about Tinadril's. We hear about Tor's in a little bit at the end of the story, but they had their distinct sets of experiences. They came to a greater knowledge of the good, and then they were reunited and elevated in a new way. Well, the same story happens here, but in a terrestrial setting. Mark and Jane are two children who are separated from each other, and then they go and they learn about what it looks like when the veil is pulled back, but in two very different and interesting ways. So it's different because it starts off in such a mundane way, but in that way, it has a much more maybe direct or immediate commentary if you're not used to thinking in terms of deep heaven and things like that.
Yeah, this, of all of Lewis's works of fiction, is probably has the most polyvalence with Lewis's various non-fictional essays.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that there are, with every single one of Lewis's work, you can find like a corresponding nonfiction work. Every single one of his works of fiction, you can find a corresponding piece of nonfiction where he's like working out the themes that he then like develops in the fiction, right? With that hideous strength, there's not actually just one that you can point to. Now, the one that's obvious to most people is the abolition of man, and this book has a really graphic and like really literal object lesson to the idea of a man without chest, right? Mm-hmm. That is like a man that's just brains and guts, which is what the head is.
Yeah,
especially the way that Jane sees it in her vision. But so that's the most obvious kind of overlap between, and Lewis says this himself in his introduction to the book. That's the most obvious overlap between his fiction and his nonfiction. But there's a bunch of other of his lesser known fictional essays, which seem to contribute a lot of ideas to that hideous strength. My favorite of which is one, it's called like, what's it called? Is it called The Lure of the Inner Circle? The Danger. Do you know this essay?
I do. Yeah.
So there's an essay by Lewis called The Inner Ring, in which he basically develops the whole idea of the kind of the lure of the inner circle and the actually dehumanizing process of constantly trying to be on the inside track of everything, right? And so one of the main characters is Mark Studdock, and Mark is, by the way, whose name is associated with Mars, right? The god of war. And it's interesting because Jane's name isn't quite Venus, because Jane is the derivative of John, right? But then, like you have John the Forerunner, for instance, who's associated with the planet Venus, and then also an association between John the Forerunner, John the Theologian, and like virginity, and so anyway, it's kind of an interesting. It's not quite Mars and Venus, but it's pretty close. I don't suppose there's actually a non-obvious female name in English that's derived from Venus or Aphrodite that wouldn't just be Venus or Aphrodite. Not one that I can think of. But Mark is continually drawn in by the lure of the inner ring, the idea of the inner circle, the idea that there's like a more exclusive set, and he gets drawn in. That's basically how he gets drawn into the plans of the folks at Bellberry, who are being controlled by demons. They're evil people. They're also progressives, wanting to torture animals and experiment on prisoners and all these other things, which were the forms that progressivism was taking in the early, the first half and even the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah,
there was like a sort of like a eugenics kind of quality to everything that was going on in the 20th century. So anyway, he's drawn in basically because he's constantly chasing, like trying to get on the inside of the next group up, and the next group up, the next group up, the next group up. And then what he sort of finds out when everything gets stripped away is that all that's left on the inside there is evil. But there's this beautiful moment that he has where he's like sitting like in a prison cell, and he's waiting to be tortured or killed. And he's able to think back over his life and think about every beautiful thing that came into his life. And this is what Lewis talks about in The Inner Ring. He's able to look back on his life and think about every beautiful thing that came into his life as part of the process of, like his twin sister, and then Jane, and then like his best friend at school, and then Jane, his wife. And as each of these beautiful things from the outside comes into his life, they have this capacity, like things outside of himself, they have this capacity to move, like to basically introduce beauty to his life in this radical way, like really actually opportunities for him to see and know God. That's what each of these people is. And then what Mark always does is sort of sacrifices or trades that person in order to move into the next inner, like the next ring, the next part of the inner circle. And to me, I mean, there's a lot you could say about the more overly diabolical parts of the story. Those are things that, thank God, most of us are not going to encounter. Sure. Although I could be wrong, because there's so many wild things that Lewis says in this book that were kind of fancy at the time, but now are completely, like commonplaces. But this lure of the inner ring, or this desire to get into the inner circle, like to be a part of the cool set, and like to chase whatever the next cool set is beyond that, and the way that it causes us to kind of like sacrifice relationships and then see other people as not as icons of the living God, but as kind of these utilitarian pieces that exist basically to serve us, to satisfy us, or to help us get to the next place that we're going, right? And so, I mean, this is what's under a lot of the talk when people talk about like networking, stuff like this, especially in the corporate world where I kind of live, 8 hours of the day. When people talk about networking, it's all about not your net worth, but your network, or, people, just all this crazy, stupid things that people throw around. But what they don't actually mean by that is you should have strong relationships of trust with people who are headed in the same direction you are, right? But what they mean by that is instead is, I need a loose network of connections where everyone is bound together, not by like friendship or a common goal or a love of the beautiful or any of those things, but rather we're bound together by the idea of mutual self-interest, right? And basically the idea that, well, if I know you and you know me, then I can help you get what you want. You can help me get what I want. And that's really the whole depth of the relationship. And there is something, because it's so utilitarian, there's something really diabolical about that.
Yeah. And that's where I think the strength is in the outright diabolical element in the story. Yeah. From Mark's perspective, it kind of comes out of left field. But this is the way in which most people experience and will experience the diabolical. You think you're committing a lot of, relatively mundane sins, just some casual, low-level backbiting and office politics and things like that. And then suddenly you walk into the next room and you find yourself face to face, so to speak, with the devil. And by the way, I just want to say that, especially for people who are on the academic or intellectual path, I would really encourage you to read that essay Richard mentioned, The Inner Ring, because I read it several years ago, and when I read it, it was pretty remarkable the way that it described temptations, which, I experienced and was experiencing. And I think everybody who's on that kind of academic intellectual track is going to experience in one level or another. The whole idea of creating relationships to feel that thrill up your leg when somebody who's really important is going to shake your hand and take you into the next room of the people in the know. And the way in which, that kind of thing can cultivate a diabolical disdain for people on the outside, where you start to just think of people as tools with whom you're going to make connections so that you can utilize them to your strategic advantage. And at some point, when you act this way, eventually it becomes natural to act this way. And that's the point at which, you are ready to meet the devil, as it were. So it's a really powerful moral story in the best sense of the narrative. And I think it's so powerful because, Lewis was a person who, I think it comes through in his work, understands that particular temptation by experience. He's clear in his other writing. He doesn't really want to say that much about sins with which he has little experience, but he says a lot about this. And this is a passion I wish people talked about more, because it's so dangerous and it can creep in so subtly. And yet when it rears its head and you're in its grip, then it's truly something really terrifying.
How would you relate this to like the classic understanding of the passions in the Christian tradition? Would you say this is a form of pride or envy, maybe?
I think it's a form of pride. And I think, pride and envy always go together, because as Lewis says, pride is the basic sin because it's inherently competitive, right?
Right.
Pride is what it is because you can only have it at other people's expense.
Yeah.
Nobody's really proud about being wealthy per se, as he says in Mere Christianity. You're proud about being wealthier than somebody else.
Yep.
And that's why you start to see people as tools to use for your own ends, because if you're all promoted together, well, you haven't really gotten anywhere. You want to stand out from the crowd. You want to be the person who everybody else is looking at and saying, wow, what a grand person you really are. And the fun thing, if I can call it that, in this book, is just the absurdity of the whole thing. And this is what Mark comes to at the end, where faced with the possibility of his imminent death, he realizes not only that he's going to die, but that everything which he really desired and was questing for was just stupid. It wasn't worth anything at all, even in the moment at which he sought it. So it's a brilliant book in that respect. And I wanted to ask you about the way in which this relates to, Dante's Inferno. You're making your way through these circles.
I'm glad that you asked about Dante, because I was about to actually draw a line between this idea of envy and not Inferno, but Purgatorio. So, which I'm currently teaching a class on Symbolic World courses for people who want to check that out. That's going great. It's been really awesome. We have 2 more sessions left. All right. So in Inferno, sins are arranged by sin and sort of categories of sin. And Dante kind of takes this idea that starts in Augustine, where you have the ideas of like upper and lower hell. And sometimes in some authors, it's like a 2-fold division of hell. Some authors, it's like a 4-fold division of hell. But Dante basically takes that. He takes that, and from it, he develops this sort of idea of sorting sins by their weight. So sins are basically, Satan falls from heaven to earth, right? He hits the earth and he smashes through the earth's mantle, and he goes all the way to the center of the planet. And then the earth, by the way, that rejects him, right, wants to get away from him, is thrown up on the other side of the planet, and that becomes the mountain of purgatory. So you have Satan and his sin as the heaviest sin is at the center of the earth. Why? Because in the Ptolemaic model of the universe, the center of the earth is the farthest away you can get from God, who is in deep heaven. I mean, we all know you can't really get away from God anywhere, but that being said, we know there's a sort of there's earth and there's heaven, and then there's something beyond the heaven, right? Mm-hmm. So the center of the earth is the farthest away you can get from heaven. So Satan falls as far as you can possibly fall, because every direction from earth is up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So the way that sins are sorted in hell doesn't actually follow a lot of more traditional medieval settings, because a lot of medieval settings are usually sort things by the 7 deadly sins. Now we're going to put a pin in that 7 deadly sins thing, because it's actually not quite accurate. But Dante doesn't do that. What Dante does is he tries to sort sins so that we start with the sins where you sin as a beast, and those are kind of in other words, ways that animals can also, basically behaviors animals are also capable of, right? Animals don't sin in the way that we do, but we could say that they're capable of things that we would describe as wrath or, concupiscence, desire, things like this. So for Dante, these are actually the least severe sins. The most severe sins for Dante, going all the way down, to the lowest rings, are the sins in which we employ our reason. The sins in which we employ that part of us which we don't share with the animals. So we have animal passions in common with the animals, but what we don't have, what animals aren't capable of really of doing is running a Ponzi scheme, which would put you pretty low in hell, actually. or committing simony, or like other kinds of complex fraud, like simple and compounded fraud. These are things that animals can't do. Humans can sin in this way because we have the gift of reason. But because reason is such a great gift, it's the thing that we share in common with the angels. These are the sins which do not make you bestial, they make you demonic. Now, Lewis owes a whole lot to Dante and his kind of whole scheme of things and how he thinks about the world, and he's got a really keen sense for this. But so we'll come back to that. But in Purgatorio, things aren't sorted by sin; they're sorted by vice. So it's actually not. You'll sometimes hear the 7 deadly sins. Okay, that's not wrong, but it's not quite right either, because it's actually not the 7 deadly sins. It's the 7 deadly vices. Pride, envy, wrath, sloth, etc. Right? And here they're also sorted by weight, which means since purgatory is going up, it means you encounter the worst thing first, which is pride, and then you encounter the second worst thing next, which is envy. Now, in Purgatorio, you get something called the whip and the rein as you go up the terraces of the mountain of purgatory. Not here discussing, like the Orthodox approach to, the doctrine of purgatory or something like this. But this is how Dante sees things, okay? And Dante wouldn't even say it's actually a dogmatic. Like he's not giving a map for the afterlife. He's doing something different. So the symbolism is really important. As you go up the mountain of purgatory, as you hit each terrace, you get something called the whip, which is a little counterintuitive, but the whip is a positive example of the virtue you need to fight this passion. So it's supposed to drive you on towards virtue. And then there's the rein, which is something that's intended to sort of rein in the passions and slow you down. And the reins are always negative examples. In other words, if you don't deal with this passion in your life, this is who you end up as. Now, following a text called The Mirror of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is it's attributed to Bonaventure. There's some other people that think somebody else wrote it. Doesn't matter for our purposes. Dante read it. And one of the main themes of the mirror is expounding upon, which is really a commentary on the Hail Mary, is that the Mother of God, as full of grace, contains within herself all of the virtues at their most mature, at their most perfect. And so she is the best example of the virtue that you need to fight each one of the 7 deadly vices. So the virtue that you need to fight pride is humility. The virtue that you need to fight envy is caritas, charity. Now, in the example, this is what I'm coming to. In the example that from the life of the Virgin, which is given on the 2nd terrace of Purgatorio, that is the terrace of envy. The example that's given is when she says to Jesus, "They have no wine." Now, this is from John chapter 2, right? Now, you could ask the question, what's this have to do with envy? Right? How is this not? But I think that the kind of envy that Lewis deals with in the Inner Ring, and that you see Mark Studdock guilty of as kind of his besetting, because he's obviously not a proud man in the sense that he's, actually if he had more pride, he wouldn't have done a bunch of the things that he did.
Mm-hmm.
like if he was, more proud, he would not have, gone along with a lot of things he was being asked to go along with, right? Sometimes our pride keeps us from other things, which is, I don't know, it's a weird thing. Like, that's not the right reason to not sin, but sometimes it does keep us from certain sins. Yeah. So, but envy seems to be, in my estimation anyways, Mark's really his besetting sin. And but the way that Lewis describes it in the Inner Ring, it's the sense of a kind of envy that's always wants to feel a little like more. You always want to feel superior to your peer group, whoever your peer group is. So the thing that makes you reach for the next group is the fact that you're looking around and you're thinking, man, all of these people around me that are in my current peer group, they're all kind of dull and uninteresting, and I'm actually so much smarter and brighter than them. I really belong with that set. And then you worm your way, you get into that set, and then you look around at these people and you say, oh, these people are all actually much duller and less intelligent and everything. I really belong with these people, right? And you keep trying to move your way through the rings.
Yeah.
And So you can kind of imagine if you have this attitude and then you're at a wedding and the wedding is going on and they're making a big deal over the bride and groom. I know people who are always terrible at weddings because they want the wedding to be about them and it's not.
Yeah.
I think everybody knows somebody like this. My aunt puts it as somebody who wants to be. My aunt is a psychologist, and the way that she put it to me once is this is a kind of person who wants to be the corpse at every funeral and the bride at every wedding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so imagine you're this kind of person. You're at a wedding and they're making a big deal over the couple, blah blah blah, all this stuff, and the celebrations are going on and on and on, and you're sort of thinking like you're envious, like you're wishing you were the center of attention. You're wishing you had the joy that they have, etc. And then they run out of something like wine or food or whatever, and it's very embarrassing because this is like a major logistical failure, something which should have been anticipated, like a good party planner. And then you start to say, well, listen, if I'd been in charge of this thing, right? Well, if this were my wedding, well, of course this would happen to the sort of people who never think about these kinds of things, blah, 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 right? And we have these really kind of petty impulses towards envy within us. So the Mother of God, when she sees this happen, right, because she's so full of charity, when she sees this happen, she goes to her son very quietly. In fact, if you look at icons of this, she's just sort of like leaning over, whispering in his ear, which I really love. And the fact that the miracle is not a miracle which was performed, although it is Christ's first public miracle, the text of the gospel according to St. John is very clear that it was basically just performed for the servants, right? Because he goes into the back with the servants, and that's where he changes the water into wine, and so that the people at the feast have no idea actually what's going on, right? And just like suddenly all this really good wine, and so she sort of like sees this embarrassing thing that could cause pain, that could cause embarrassment, etc. And instead of just sort of saying, well, that wouldn't have happened if I was in charge. I feel like there are a lot of people in the culture that I grew up in. That's what their attitude would be. Well, that wouldn't have happened if I was in charge. Wouldn't have happened if I was planning this. Oh, they really should have done this instead, because my cousin, he did that at his wedding and it worked out so well, etc. Right? Yeah. But instead she like goes quietly to her son and they have this whole exchange. So she's the antidote to that. And the thing is, to relate this back to that hideous strength, is that Mary is the actual inner circle, right, of Christianity. Like that's the inmost sanctum, right, of her faith, right? It's not so much part of our public proclamation of the gospel, but she's part of like the inner sanctum of the faith, and she demonstrates this even in her earthly life and during the earthly ministry of her son, when she takes all of these crazy things that have happened, surrounding Christ's birth and his youth and all these different things, and she takes them and she ponders them in her heart, and she never speaks of this mystery to anyone, presumably until St. Luke. So anyway, the problem about envy is that you end up actually, it's a kind of noise, right, where you're constantly thinking about other people and what they might be saying about you, and am I in, and do they like me, do they really like me, and all these different things. And it's this kind of noise that actually keeps you from coming to actually encounter like the still heart of the world, right? And so you'll never get to, if you're beset by this, you'll never actually get to the real heart of whatever body it is that you're a part of. If you're trying to get to the heart of it, if you're driven by envy, you'll never get to the real heart. So the real heart of Britain is Logos, which is one of the coolest ideas in the whole cosmic trilogy. And if I were ever to write a sequel, perhaps as a graphic novel or as a novel or something like that, I would want to expand on the idea of what's the real heart of each other country.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of closely related to what you do with the universal history thing, right? You look at the kind of inner archetypes which make a nation and culture what it is, which, by the way, guys, if you haven't checked it out, I can't imagine you haven't heard of it, but over on Jonathan Peugeot's channel, Universal History series, you need to check it out. If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting this channel as a patron or paid Substack subscriber. I post reflections on Scripture 6 days a week, and 3 of these posts are exclusive to those who are patrons or paid subscribers on Substack at $5 per month. At $10 per month, patrons have access both to all of my written content as well as to weekly exclusive videos of about a half hour per week. At $30 per month, patrons have access to all of the preceding as well as a weekly class on the Old Testament of about an hour to an hour and a half each. Finally, at $35 per month, patrons receive access to all of my written and recorded exclusive content, as well as the ability to schedule monthly calls of 1 hour every month as long as you remain a patron at this level. You can also access these benefits through channel memberships on YouTube. Please also consider purchasing my lecture sets, Answering Protestantism from the Bible, 17 hours, and Answering Calvinism from the Bible, 6.5 hours. These can be purchased either individually or together for a discount. All links are in the description box and pinned comment. Your support, both financially and especially through your daily prayers, is what enables me to produce regular, high quality, and original content. Thank you so much. Well, you mentioned noise, and kind of that brings me to something that I really wanted to talk about today. I want to focus in our next video on the way the Arthurian tradition relates to this whole thing, because I think you have a lot to say there, but I don't want to give you the time to say it. In relation to noise, I think that, the hideous strength, the title of the book refers to, I think it's a passage from Milton. Is it Milton?
No, it's not Milton. It's I've completely blanked out, but I have the original quote right here. Okay, hold on. This is a good question. I talked about this. You were at the summit, were you? You didn't come to the...
I didn't. No.
You should have come.
Yeah, my firstborn just came into the world.
Children.
I know.
All right, so this is from a line from there's a 16th century Scottish herald and poet named David Lindsay.
Okay.
And he has a poem called A Dialogue Between Experience and a Courtier, or it's also just called Monarchy. And it's basically is a work of universal history in the medieval mode, in which Lindsay, who is himself, I think, a Puritan, dwells on the downfalls of the great rulers of the ages as a warning to the church and the state in his own time. And so this is how the line goes. From the title that the title of this book comes from. It says, the translator of Orosius in his chronicle writes thus, that when the sun is at the height, at noon when it doth shine most bright, the shadow of that hideous strength, 6 mile and more, is of length. Thus 6 mile and more it is of length. Thus may ye be settled in your thought whether Babylon be high or not. So this quote has to do with his description of the Tower of Babel. Mm-hmm. And he's quoting, he says the translator of Orosius says this. So Orosius is a 5th century Latin author. He was really widely read during the Middle Ages. He also wrote a work of universal history called The Histories Against the Pagans, which is basically the unauthorized sequel to Augustine's The City of God, and actually might have been sort of authorized. But Orosius is widely read in the Middle Ages, as I mentioned, and basically he's one of the main models for other medieval authors of medieval universal history who would come later. And what's unique about Orosius is that although he begins his chronicle with the creation of the world by God, he includes almost no details from Genesis. There's nothing in there about the garden, nothing in there about the flood, nothing in there about the Tower of Babel, because what he's basically focused on doing is taking the histories of the pagans and showing how the histories of the pagans show Christianity to be true. So he takes it as a granted that you already know Genesis. So he spends no time at all basically repeating material from Genesis. Now, so it's interesting that Lindsay says Orosius, except that he doesn't say Orosius. So there's no Tower of Babel in Orosius. This is what I'm trying to say. So you could sort of say, well, wait a minute. Lindsay says he's getting this number from Orosius, but how could he be getting this number from Orosius when Orosius never mentions the Tower of Babel? And basically the answer to that question is that he actually says it's the translator of Orosius. And this seems to have been an unknown Anglo-Saxon scribe who during the golden years of Alfred the Great's literary undertakings, he translates, I'm going to put that in scare quotes because it's really translation in a medieval, like in the medieval sense of translation, which is sort of more like redaction. Like you take something and then you sort of say, well, this seems not quite right to me, or I want to add some material for context. And people aren't bothered by the idea of like authorship and originality to the same degree in the Middle Ages. And so he translates Orosius's work under the patronage of Alfred the Great. And one of the deficiencies that he seems to correct is the problem that there are not enough giants, and there's not enough Genesis, and these are the things Anglo-Saxons really liked. So he just adds some stuff in. So this is what he writes about Babylon. He says, Nimrod the giant first began to build Babylon, and after him King Ninus, and then Semiramis, his queen, finished it in the middle of her reign. The city was built on open and very level land. It was very fair to look upon, and is quite a true square. The greatness and firmness of the wall, when it is stated, is hardly to be believed. It is 50 ells broad and 200 ells high, and the circumference is 70 miles and the seventh part of a mile. Again, I'm just translating from Old English. So the translator of Orosius goes on to describe the Tower of Babel and then the whole city of Babylon, and he meditates on it as this warning to the rest of humanity. And he ends this meditation by saying, this very city of the Babylonians, which was the greatest and first of all cities, is now the least and most desolate. Right? So the idea is that you had this great thing, and then they were full of pride. The Anglo-Saxon word is overmod, which is like over mind or over mood, and they fell into ruin. And so Lindsay uses that trend. So there you have Orosius, and you have the unnamed translator of Orosius into Old English, and you have Lindsay using him as the source for his evocative image in his own universal history, which is of this idea of a city so great that at noon, when the sun is directly overhead, so you have the least number of shadows, right? That at noon it casts a shadow 6 miles long, right? Mm. So that's the idea. And this is also, by the way, one of the traditional measurements for the circumference of the walls of the city of Babylon. Mm-hmm. So he's kind of saying something about you could say like the oppressive rule, the hideous strength for which Babylon stands. Mm-hmm. And then this is where Lewis picks it up. So remember that Lindsay is from the 16th century. And so Lewis is a specialist in 16th century literature. And he uses this line for his the title of his fairy tale about for grown-ups, as he calls it, right? Which is concerned with basically the erecting and the downfall of a modern day Babel-like project, mm-hmm. And which is much more similar. Actually, it's very similar to the kind of Babel-like projects that we have currently going on in our own day. I mean, one of the weirdly prescient things about this book is the way that Lewis has his ultra evil organization have the cuddliest name possible. Yeah. So it's like the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, I think, which stands for, which is nice, right? Yeah. So it's the nice organization, right? and nowadays, like our big, Babylonian powerhouses have these really innocuous sounding names like Apple and Google, and I refuse to call it Meta, Facebook, right? These are all like kind of like nice sort of sounding things, Alphabet, and so on, right? And so, I mean, that's one of the weird things. Like, it's the only thing Lewis, you could say, really gets wrong with his nice is simply the scale. Because I think if you're going to write this book now, you'd have to be, obviously Lewis doesn't anticipate the internet, right? I don't think anybody could have anticipated like the vast reach of something like the internet, and AI and all these other things. But he's already like, man, he's already starting to see the way that things were going all the way back in the 50s. So
yeah. And I think that the title of the organization And the fact that the title of the organization does not communicate its real inner essence really captures in a specific way what Lewis is going for in connecting this course of evil with the Tower of Babel, which is all about the inversion of language, the stripping of language of the end for which it was created, which is, of course, union with the Logos and things like that. And what you find, of course, this has a lot to do with the end of the book, where we find the NIC's downfall through the curse on their language. But you find it exemplified in all these little ways in Mark's interactions with the people in the NICE. One of my favorite chapters, which really made an impression on me the first time I read this book, and the first time I actually was able to get through it was just, it was like 2018 or so. So I'd read the other two books before, but that Hideous Strength I saved for later. The big impression that it made on me, the chapter which made a big impression on me, was the chapter on elasticity and the conversations that Mark would have with the powers that be in the NICE, which is that nothing anybody said had any clear or distinct meaning. It was just words that just flowed out without any kind of specific end or purpose. And of course, this is a big theme in the Cosmic Trilogy, because at least from Paralandra onwards, where the language of the Horos is kind of retconned as the universal language, which people spoke before the Tower of Babel, it's alluded to briefly, is a language in which meanings are inherent in the shape of the sounds themselves. And so this is the language which was spoken before the flood and beyond the moon. This is the language where even the word itself carries the meaning. It can't not carry that meaning. And then you take the kind of language that they speak in the NICE, and it's a language of absolute meaninglessness and nothingness. But it's all, in a sense, very nice. I mean, Withers seems like a nice guy. He's like, hey, I'm
I tell you what,
for you.
The sheer number of people that I've worked with in my corporate career who talk like Wither, is deeply demoralizing. When I first encountered his character, reading the book as an adult anyway, I was like, whoa, this is way too familiar for comfort. Like, it's not difficult to kind of imagine, especially as sort of like in the corporate world, there's always like buzzwords that people like to just string together, talking about, it was like synergy for a while. It's like everything's got to be synergized, and but there's always buzzwords. I don't even know what they are now, because I'm kind of much more on the other side of the business now. But there's so many of those kinds of things that it's just not difficult at all to imagine. But I think that even honestly, the whole kind of DEI speak now, right, around diversity, equity, inclusion, and all these different words, it's like that it has its own kind of meaningless vocabulary and jargon, which I'm sure is very meaningful to people who are deep inside of it. But except that people will do things like sending around a fake article about the stuff that's really just a bunch of jargon and buzzwords put together, and it'll get accepted by journals and things like that. And it's a world in which the meaning is never certain and nailed down, right? And I think the people who want to take advantage of you, one of the main ways they will do that is to exploit the ambiguity, to exploit ambiguity in language. And so, even, man, I guess I'm just like talking about politics. So I may as well just continue to irritate people. So there was this statement by the Pope earlier this week. In Singapore, something about all religions being, paths to God and whatever else, and so that quote came out, and it was in Italian, and a lot of people in the world speak Italian, and so it was translated, and then obviously a lot of people were really upset about it. And then what happened almost immediately is that all these people kind of came out of the woodwork with their explanations for, well, it didn't actually mean that, it actually means this other thing, right? And try to put ambiguity in. Now, I have no idea what the Pope's intent was when he said those words. I'm not, I'm not his judge. I'm not his confessor. But I'm very, let me put it this way, I'm very suspicious of people whose main way of speaking or main way of dialogue is to exploit the ambiguity in language instead of just saying what they mean,
Yeah.
And that is one of the methods of control that the demons in this book use.
Yeah. And I mean, you see it in Wither's speech, that it even kind of makes the question of what does Wither mean by this kind of irrelevant. It's an improperly framed question. He doesn't really mean anything by it at all. He's just using language as a tool to get somebody to do what he wants. He's not communicating idea. And it's also, you see it in a very funny way, I think, at the near the end of the book, where all of the leadership is gathered together, and you've got Jewel there who thinks he's the head, and he's spouting off all of these ideas which are filled with jargon, and he thinks they're fancy new ideas. And I love this chapter, by the way, just to get political again, because still today people are proposing reforms of the system based on retributive justice with the same conviction that they are proposing a fundamentally new and revolutionary idea, which is
right. Exactly. Yeah. I can sort of get behind the idea of there being sort of like corporate guilt, in the sense that a nation can sin, and therefore a nation as nation should repent. But this idea of corporate guilt, but also, where I don't need, what's the jargon? It's like unburdened. It's the like the whole unburdened by what has been, or whatever. Like, I mean, that's a nice bit of jargon, like people hear that phrase, which I can't even perfectly remember right now, and sort of think, okay, wait a minute, what is that exactly? But it seems to be something like, we should be able to, like move forward, leaving tradition in the past, right? Consigning it to the dustbin of history, right? But we're not leaving anybody's guilt in the past, right? We're not leaving, we could say there are genuinely awful, evil things that were done to people from Africa when they were brought to this country, the way that they were brought to this country, the way that they were treated throughout, Southern slavery and Jim Crow laws and all these other things. All that stuff is super evil. And I kind of, like, I'm sympathetic to the idea that there needs to be some kind of a repentance on this, but nobody's actually interested in repentance. What people want is to use this as like a, man, I'm just really getting in all kinds of trouble today. But but it's clear that this is not about repentance. Let me just put it that way. It's clear that this is not about sackcloth and ashes, right? Because So anyway, but that the progressive agenda is kind of it's a weird thing about progressivism, is that it's only the past wrongs are things you can carry forward. But if there's something good, but I guess the idea of progressivism is that nothing from the past is really good, right? The most you can ever say is that it was good enough for its time. But now we know better. We can kind of move on. So
yeah.
So,
I want to just kind of close today, and then we can talk about this more next time, because I think there's so much to say about this. By asking you about the feminine aspect of this book, because Narnia, of course, has female characters, but they're children for the most part. This, more than Lewis's other writing, features a lot of female characters, and there's a lot of discussion in here, like there was in Paralandra, about the polarity of the masculine and the feminine, and the ontological role that plays in the creation, and the way that it, shapes out the warp and woof of history and personal relations and all that kind of stuff. And there's things that are very high and metaphysical, and then there's things that are very like concrete, like who should do the chores and how should we do chores together, that are in this book. So do you want to just kind of say something about what Lewis is getting at here with his whole vision?
There is a subtle attack on feminism, maybe not so subtle attack on feminism in this book. Again, I'm just getting your channel canceled, except that all the people who watch your channel probably are, you know, like, oh no, he should be more strident against feminism. But
Yeah.
you know, there is definitely Jane as the sort of the primary female point of view character. A big part of her problem is that the world that she is growing up in and the world that she's embraced is not a world that allows her to be a woman. And so she's never able to really enjoy like female things as being, you know, feminine things as being feminine things, right? And one of the ways in which she's not being allowed to be a woman is that she and Mark have made the decision not to have any children, at least not for a while, right? And there's this crazy moment where whenever they meet Merlin, we'll talk about Merlin next time because I have a lot to say about Merlin.
Yeah.
And fairies in general. People ask me about fairies. It seems like this is the thing I get asked about the most nowadays.
Yeah.
So I promise, if you guys tune in to the next episode here on Seraphim's channel, I will tell you guys what the deal is with fairies definitively once and for all. You'll never need another answer. Okay. But when they meet Merlin, Merlin sees her, and because Merlin is a seer and can prophesy and knows things, he basically says, you know, you should kill this woman at once, because if she had conceived and born a child when she was supposed to, then that child would have driven back the enemies of God for 100 years. And now the window is past, right? That child is never going to be born. And this is like a harsh moment, you know, and it's pretty interestingly navigated by the modern characters in the story when they're having to deal with sort of Merlin's, you know, I think the book calls it bloodthirstiness, right? Yeah. But there is this idea that by choosing to put off children, Jane and Mark have kept something good from happening. And in fact, they have directly contributed to the decay of the world, right? That if they'd been able to have, if they had born children, and this child in particular, like, it would have been for the healing of the world, and they failed to do that. And so in some respect, they're now culpable and they're guilty. And that's not all on Jane. I'm not saying that at all, because it takes two to tango, as I think most of us know. But there's definitely this kind of sense that one of the things that Jane regains when she comes to St. Anne's, oh boy, I have a lot to say even about the name of the place, St. Anne's. Don't let me forget that next time, okay? There's all these crazy medieval legends. Maybe I'll read some of one to you next time about like demons coming to St. Anne and like trying to seduce her so that Mary won't be born and stuff like this. And anyway, but they're connected in kind of a weird way actually with the legends of Merlin, who in one particular, you know, medieval legend is like the son of a demon and a human woman or something like that. So anyway, we'll talk about this some more next time. Don't let me forget. But yeah, so one of the things that seems to be happening is that when Jane comes to St. Anne's, is that she regains her womanhood, and at first it's like, even in a kind of a dangerous way, like it definitely seems that, you know, as she falls under she sort of falls in love with the director, like with Ransom a little bit, you know, like in a way that's not good, right? And she has to kind of figure out how to redirect that energy and that affection and that sort of, you know, the desire and the willingness to like submit. She has to redirect that to her own husband, who she just, for various reasons. I mean, the other thing is it's not just against feminism, because one of the things that Mark has to rediscover is how to be a man, and he has significantly less help than Jane does. But in any case, so I think that Lewis has some very startling things to say about fertility and birth control and things like this, which I think are kind of amazing for like a bachelor who got married very late in life and definitely had like probably a dubious sexual history at certain times of his life. I mean, some people believe there's evidence to suggest that he had an affair with a much older woman when he was very young and very impressionable, and in modern light, that seems pretty sinister, and I don't know what kind of effect it might have had on him. But in any case, it doesn't really so much matter for our purposes. He's weirdly insightful about this. And so there's this idea that on the earth facing side of the moon, that is Solva, there's a race of people who don't engage in proper reproduction, right? And so they're so delicati, or delicanti, that they basically have sexual relations with these hyper real facsimiles that they've made of each other, but then it's completely a sterile union, and the offspring are basically then grown in a lab. And if you sort of like take pornography and in vitro fertilization, and you put those two things together, that's a perfect description of what's going on the earth facing side of the moon. And so when Merlin sees Jane, he says, I didn't know that the uses of Solva had spread so far in your society. In other words, by basically engaging in sex without the possibility of childbearing, that something there's something malign in the world about this. And I didn't know I was going to talk about birth control. I mean, this is like, I'm just like everything I could possibly ever get in trouble for saying, like, yeah. I've now said, but I mean, this is what Lewis talks about in the book. This is what Lewis talks about in the book. Like, it's very clear that without like deriving like a dogmatic statement on birth control or something like this, which I for one would not be comfortable doing, since I'm neither a bishop nor the son of a bishop, but it's very clear that this idea of sex is just for desire, it's just for pleasure, and kind of this ruling out of childbearing as as its natural part, right, as its natural consequence, that this makes something break in the world. And that seems to be very clear from the society that we live in today. That's another way that, in my mind, I've been thinking about this a lot today, but this is one of the ways in which I think Lewis is sort of weirdly prescient. So
if marriage and sexuality is really a created image of the unification of heaven and earth, of God in the world, of Christ in the church, we should not be surprised that an immense amount of energy is spent in the enemy's camp trying to control that and direct it towards his own end. I think it's in this, and this is something that Lewis, who was, in his own way, very into certain kind of esoteric ideas, or esoteric authors, though he, read them. He encouraged people to be very, very careful with this sort of stuff. But there's a reason that people in that kind of occult sphere will do a lot of magic with sex. Because there genuinely is something of cosmic significance that is happening there. And so you want to kind of grab it, bottle it up, and then push it towards your own ends. We will keep talking about masculine and feminine language, the Arthurian tradition, St. Anne's, all of this stuff in our next discussion. Richard, thank you so much. I think you may have made this the spiciest video ever.
I will just say, folks, I'm like, to say you should get married and have babies should be the least controversial thing that anybody could ever possibly say, because it's literally the only way that civilization continues, that the human race continues. Right? Like, it's the normal way to do things. So shouldn't be at all controversial, but this is always the hot button one. Like, the people come out of the woodwork for this one. So anyway,
thank you so much, and we will talk to you again next time.
All right. Thanks, Seraphim.
Thank you.
If you enjoy this content, please consider supporting this channel as a patron or paid Substack subscriber. I post reflections on Scripture 6 days a week, and 3 of these posts are exclusive to those who are patrons or paid subscribers on Substack at $5 per month. At $10 per month, patrons have access both to all of my written content as well as to weekly exclusive videos of about a half hour per week. At $30 per month, patrons have access to all of the preceding as well as a weekly class on the Old Testament of about an hour to an hour and a half each. Finally, at $35 per month, patrons receive access to all of my written and recorded exclusive content, as well as the ability to schedule monthly calls of 1 hour every month as long as you remain a patron at this level. You can also access these benefits through channel memberships on YouTube. Please also consider purchasing my lecture sets, Answering Protestantism from the Bible, 17 hours, and Answering Calvinism from the Bible, 6.5 hours. These can be purchased either individually or together for a discount. All links are in the description box and pinned comment. Your support, both financially and especially through your daily prayers, is what enables me to produce regular, high quality, and original content. Thank you so much.